Welcome back. In the previous step, we looked at a quick review of the types of data bindings that we have used until now. There are other kinds of data bindings which we'll be talking about a little later. In this step, let's introduce some validation around the username and the password. One of the important things that you need to remember is the validation that we would introduce in this specific step is kind of a hard-coded validation. We are just getting started with Angular and we would want to understand the possibilities with Angular. So let's hard-code stuff in here. Typically, this is not something you do in a production application. Remember that warning before you would go into this specific step. Let's move to the login.component.html template. I'll remove the username interpolation stuff which is present in here. What I'll do is I'll comment this out, Control/ or Command/. What we want to do is we would want to introduce a validation around the username and the password. What we'll do for now is we'll use the handle login method. So in the handle login method, what we'll do is we'll introduce the hard-coded logic. What we want to do is when a specific username and password is entered which are considered login, that's fine. But if an invalid username and password are entered, what we want to show is a message saying invalid credentials at the top. So how can we show a message saying invalid credentials at the top? What should we edit? We should go obviously to the HTML, right? So let's go here and let's add a simple, I'll use a small font and I'll say invalid credentials. So what would happen? Now invalid credentials are shown. Let's put a div around the username and the password so that it's actually shown on the next line. Let's tab them in as well. Okay, cool. Now let's see what would happen. So invalid credentials is shown on the top, username, password. That's cool. But the thing is, we only want to show invalid credentials in the case of invalid credentials, right? So right now user has not even clicked the login button and we are showing invalid credentials. That's not really good. The other thing is I don't really like the fact that this is hard coded in here. Let's actually move it to the login component, the message. So I'll call this error message is equal to invalid credentials and I would want to use it from the error message. How can I use it here? Simple, right? Interpolation. Cool. Let's put error message. You'd see that it's as usual. Now in the handle login, let's write a little bit of business logic to identify who's an invalid user and who's not an invalid user. So I'll create a variable here called invalid login and initially it would be false. Let's comment this out and let's say if this dot username is equal to, in Java we would typically use double is equal to. In JavaScript the safest way to do comparison is by using triple is equal to. So I'll say if this dot username is equal to in 28 minutes and this dot user password triple is equal to dummy, then invalid login is equal to false. What we are saying is in this kind of scenario invalid login is equal to false. This is kind of a mistake which we typically do. What's the solution? Think about it. What should I do? This, right? In JavaScript you always need to use this. So this dot invalid login is equal to false. Else this dot invalid login is equal to true. Cool? Isn't this interesting? Now I'm saving this. Will this make a difference? I click login. Oops, nothing is getting printed because we have removed the console.log, but it's not really toggling the invalid credentials. Now what I would want to do is I would want to tie this invalid login value to the display of this error message. How can I do that? I would want to say show this only if invalid login is true. How can I do that? The way you can do that is by adding a ng attribute, an Angular attribute. As we discussed earlier, Angular attributes add additional meaning to HTML, and over here we use something called ngIf. So show this element only if invalid login. Let's save this and oops, you see that the invalid login message disappeared. And now when I click login, because I've entered in 28 minutes an empty password, it shows invalid credentials. If I say dummy and say login, it disappears. Enter another password, login, invalid credentials. Isn't this cool? In this step, we enhance the handle login method with some hard-coded authentication logic. This is not what you do in typical production applications. For now, it helps us to get going with Angular. And what we did is we used this authentication logic to tie up the error message down to a ng directive, ngIf. And we implemented some small business logic around it. I'm having a lot of fun introducing all these concepts to you, and I'm sure you're having a lot of fun too. I'll see you in the next step.